If there really was a God, he wouldn't let this happen to me. Or maybe I'm being a little dramatic, but there's absolutely no way that I'll ever be able to make the meeting now. It takes 7 hours to get to London, and obviously I plan to have 3 to spare before it started. But with the 4th delay of this fucking plane, there's no chance I'll ever be able to make it. So I'm just sitting here, waiting. I'm sure there's going to be another 2, 3, 4, 10 delays before they finally decide that they're comfortable enough to take off. At this point, though it won't actually happen for 6 hours, the impossibility of ever being able to make the meeting has taken away all of the stress I have about missing it. My mind's already come to terms with its inevitability, so it almost feels like it's already happened. It's funny, I guess, how that works. It's almost like time traveling. It's still bullshit, though. I'm amazed that airlines even let this happen anymore. You'd think that with the huge drop-off in people actually wanting to fly nowadays, they wouldn't be doing anything to have people refuse their service for something that actually makes sense. I think I saw on the news the other day that in the last 5 years, something like 40% of people who used to fly fully refuse to anymore. And most everybody they interviewed had that same stupid, superstitious answer: the disappearances. People have been saying it so much now that it makes it sound like it's almost a real thing. Like it's anything more than statistics. Flying has always been a risk. You're in a metal tube 10 miles high going 300 miles an hour. Obviously, you're not going to be as safe as you would be hiding in your living room. But all transportation is dangerous. Cars slam into other cars way more often. Boats can sink just like a plane can fall. Trains can collide and derail. I mean, for God's sake, even a horse can hoof punch you in the chest, and that's lights out too. At the end of the day, I'd rather have a guy whose job it is to transport somebody in something doing exactly that in a wide open space. It must just be the idea of a plane crash that gets people. I couldn't imagine what it's like, but honestly, of all the ways to die while getting from point A to point B, a plane crash is, on average, the quickest and most painless way to go. The disappearances. It's so dramatic, so science fiction-y, so needlessly ornamental. Everybody wants their life to be a movie, but it's not. Life is mundane and boring and just something to do before we die. But still, for most, their emotions get the best of them, and they let themselves think up these wild stories and theories for things that have perfectly rational solutions. Then, they let those stories control their lives. It's sad. The planes aren't disappearing, they're crashing. It happens. And if a plane crashes over the ocean, then of course you're not going to find many remnants. I suppose it is odd that there are seemingly more planes crashing now than maybe there were before, but again, there's a rational explanation. The news gets views by telling stories that scare us. And since they see just how well these plane crashing reports have caught on, they're just playing them up. They'll say anything to make people stay on their channel. It's how they make money, and it's what they've always done. In fact, I'm sure no more plane accidents are happening now than there were for the past 60 years. The only difference is that now we get the privilege of hearing about all of them. I don't get it. I don't get people. There's so many other important things to worry about. You want to hear about something that's actually been on the rise in the last 5 years? Global catastrophes. There have been more earthquakes, more tsunamis, and more instances of crazy weather all over the globe. But no, the media can't paint that into a weird everything is connected theory to force feed down the mouths of people who want to be afraid of some concrete enemy, a concrete entity. I mean, you should hear some of these stupid fucking stories people come up with. I've heard the reason for these plane crashes being attributed to everything from Russians killing people from the West for fun, to aliens kidnapping us for probing, to the Illuminati doing vague Illuminati stuff. The Illuminati theory doesn't have a lot of development behind it. It seems like if somebody just says that the Illuminati is behind something, that's good enough for a lot of people. I don't know. They just delayed the plane again. Jesus Christ. I walked over to the customer service booth, an oxymoron more often than not, and had my choice of 3 near-identical looking brunettes who all had the same permanently etched fake smile, which was part of their uniform. It's just one of those things that people do in society to make other people in society think that they actually care about their problems. Anyway, I chose the middle one, like I'm sure most do. She was the youngest, and her smile was the most convincing. The others' real opinions of their jobs and the people they constantly had to deal with were evidently clear in their dead eyes. I stepped up to the booth and returned her fake smile with one of my own. Hi, I'm flying to London on LCT 1890 and it just had its 5th delay. I was wondering if you knew why? Let me check on that for you, sir. She started clicking away at her computer, valiantly looking up an answer to a question that I knew she couldn't care less about. Well, sir, it seems like air control has been combining a few flights in order to have one full plane that flies to Europe. A lot of passengers have had direct flights to different European cities cancelled, and instead they'll have a layover in London. So the delays are simply air control consolidating more flights into yours until the plane is full. She said that like it made any fucking sense. Well, that's weird. Isn't that weird? We apologize, sir, she responded. No, what I'm saying is that doesn't make sense. I mean, every flight for years has been a quarter filled. Why is this one different? I asked her this knowing exactly the response I was going to get. Honestly, it was more myself thinking out loud than it was posing a question to somebody who I believed could actually provide any help. I don't know, sir, she said in the same sweet voice that she'd been performing with for years. Sweetheart, I need to get to London. I have a very important meeting that I've already missed, but I may be able to salvage something of the business relationship if I'm able to get there. Do you have any information or idea about when this flight's going to leave? I asked. The forced politeness in my voice was gone. It disappeared in an instant. Patience is a weakness of mine when it comes to talking with people who have no idea what's ever going on. I don't know, sir. The airline sends its apologies and will compensate, of course, for any long-term delays, but as of right now, all I can tell you is that the flight will likely board soon. It was perfect. The perfect cookie-cutter corporate conclusion that simultaneously gives the impression that they're sorry about how their fuck-up affects you, while also keeping just a far enough distance away from the situation to make it seem like it was up to the will of a god or something. Ridiculous. I walked back to my seat and just stared at the departure board. I saw 4 other European-bound flights already canceled, so I guess the lady was telling the truth about wanting to fill the plane up. Didn't make it any less weird, though. I mean, what made this flight so special that it had to be packed to the brim? I guess the only thing to do, though, was wait. I mean, 5 flights in one at this point? The plane must be filled soon. I called my business partner, explained the situation, and told him that my arrival was up to the will of some higher power. He laughed. I mean, he was clearly upset, but he knew that it wasn't anybody's fault, so he had no real reason to get personally upset with me. Still, we were both annoyed, and it wasn't hard to tell. Eventually, I hung up, settled into my chair, and just stared at the board, waiting for my flight to be called. 3 hours later, I was finally sitting in my cramped seat, watching the flight attendants play their game of charades to a filled plane of people who weren't even pretending to pay attention. When I looked up from my phone, they were showing how to blow up the life jackets, and the next time I looked up, they were gone. I glanced around at everybody else in the cabin. They were all wearing the same beleaguered face that I assumed I was. Everybody stared straight down, trying to distract themselves from the pre-flight jitters with whatever they brought. The middle-aged people were on their phones, all playing different variations of the same mind-numbing game that involved putting colorful shapes into groups with other colorful shapes. Old people were reading books, young people were pretending to read books. It was the usual. When the jets pushed me into an inseparable When the jets pushed me into an inseparable blob with my overpriced seat, I got the usual flutters in my stomach. I don't know why that happens. It's one of those few times where no matter how rational I try to speak internally, I can't seem to fully quell my reaction. Perhaps it's the body's natural realization that if anything were to happen on the flight, then its fate was, from that point on, set in stone. This time it was worse, though. Not overwhelmingly worse. I wasn't breathing into a paper bag like the overweight millennial beside me, but it was more than the usual slight sink in my stomach. It has to be because I'm just so tired. I mean, I've been living in an airport for a day and a half at this point. My back was stiff, my neck was sore, and my attitude was already negative. That's probably why. Maybe it was because I was flying internationally? That's possible. Or maybe... God damn it. Maybe all those stupid fucking conspiracy theories are subconsciously getting to me. It makes no sense. I know it makes no sense, but I guess to some extent if you hear something enough times, then it could get to you. Regardless of the reason, the fact was that we were already in the air, so worrying wouldn't do me any good. As we drifted further and further from New York, and as the rigid metal ground turned to a smooth blue, I was starting to get disgruntled. The feeling hadn't gone. Here I was, still stewing in my worry. I kept trying to explain to myself the pointlessness of the fear, but my usual semi-nihilistic pep talk didn't do me any good this time. I needed a distraction. Grabbing my carry-on, I ripped out my folder and started to bury myself in the notes and statistics that I needed to be an expert on for whatever was left of this meeting. But it didn't work. After tossing it back into my bag, I pulled out the book I'd been reading instead. I tried to force myself into it, to read every word with the silent dedication of a monk, but I couldn't do it. My mind was flying. Somehow, in fact, my nerves were getting worse. My stomach was turning. I was getting to the point where I couldn't even take a deep breath anymore. In a final attempt to distract myself, I put my headphones on and listened to the music that usually brings me a degree of comfort. Paul Simon. I love him. He always calms me down. My father and I used to listen to him on the floor of the living room some nights after he got back from a stressful day at work, and I picked that up from him. So now, even though I've gotten somewhat used to having a life filled with stressful situations, and I'm usually able to handle it with just a quick stop and think session, I still flood my ears with him when everything just gets to be too much. And it always works. Except now, for some fucking reason. Practically making my ears bleed with the most uplifting chord progression of all time. All I can think about is the sinking pit in my stomach. I kept turning the volume up and my phone was yelling at me, telling me that as long as I wanted to be deaf by 35, I should keep it up. But I didn't stop. At that point, I was doing shit just to do shit. Desperately trying to distract myself by doing 1,000 things at a time, but nothing was working. I'm sure to everybody around me, I looked like an idiot. Like one of those circus monkeys playing the drums while riding a unicycle, but I didn't care. My darting eye, bleeding ears, and restless hands were being tortured as I was comparing statistics while blasting "You Can Call Me Al," while staring at the least unattractive flight attendant bend down to get the loud 12-year-old his Pringles, and then jumping over to my book while watching a little blinking animated airplane sail across the Atlantic on the flight tracker while trying to... Wait. The flight tracker? That's weird. We aren't going towards England. We were, but now we're not. Why did we take that hard left? Am I wrong? No. No, there's no way. That's London, that's New York, and that's not a straight line between the two. It's not even close. We're heading north. Like, almost directly north. By now, the flight attendant and her tanks stuffed with chips and soda came to my seat. She bent down to me. I threw my headphones off. "Anything to eat, sir? Anything to... Where are we going?" I was blunt, and I know I sounded rude, but I didn't care. I didn't have the patience to put on the act of pleasantries before, and now, after my stomach felt like it'd been in a dogfight for the past 45 minutes, I certainly didn't feel like faking it. "London, sir," she said, clearly confused. I pointed at the flight tracker. That's London. I made a circle with my finger on the screen. It fought back with somewhat intense friction, no doubt due to the hundreds of little kids who switched between the inside of their noses and the chair-mounted iPad in front of them. Gross. And that's us. Why aren't we going to London? The stewardess, having watched my presentation, also seemed somewhat confused as her company-mandated smile faded, but only for a split second. Her pearly whites and forcefully crinkled eyes returned, and she looked back at me. Well, sir, I could check with the captain, but it seems as though we've only taken just a slight detour, likely due to weather or changing flight patterns or something of the like. I looked at her as she looked at me. And for some reason, at that moment, I didn't believe her. I'm sure that she believed herself. I mean, the answer was perfectly reasonable, but again, just at that moment, I didn't have any faith in the verity of what she said. That only lasted for a second, though, as a semblance of rationality returned to my mind. Yes, of course. That makes sense. Thank you. I turned back to my seat and put my headphones back on as she continued down the aisle with her cart. What was going on with me? I was turning into some type of paranoia-stricken maniac. Flying was a vital and regular part of my job, and I've grown as accustomed to it as I have driving a car, but now, for some reason, I'm reacting like a 7-year-old. Should the pilots give me a little wings pin? Should they let me see the cockpit? Would it help if they called me brave and strong for getting on the flight? It's ridiculous. I'm spiraling deeper and deeper into this looming sense of dread that is solely a product of my own mind. I don't know what I have to do, but I need to do something. Suddenly a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed. Following up the arm, I saw the terrified face of the air stewardess from before. Both of her eyebrows were positioned at the same angled slant of worried confusion as she stared at me for a second, along with most everybody else in the cabin. Sir, are you okay? I admit I was embarrassed. Yes. Sorry, I don't I don't know what that was. I was just in my own world, I suppose. You scared me. Sir, I came to ask you to turn your music down a bit. Some other passengers have had complaints. At that moment, I realized just how loud Paul Simon was screaming Cecilia. He was practically drowning out the sound of the engine. Oh, of course. Sorry. I quickly paused the music and put my headphones away entirely. I don't know what was happening to me or where these nerves were coming from. Starting to feel like a madman, to be honest. Must have been the whole day just catching up with me. And my stupid brain feeding my sense of dread. And then my stupid brain feeding my sense of dread like a farmer fattening a pig. I put everything away, in fact. My papers, my books, my phone, everything. Then, I took one last look at the flight tracker, seeing that we still haven't turned back on course, and getting, again, that initial familiar shock before reasoning with myself against the ridiculousness of my newly acquired hysteria, and closing my eyes for a nap. I hope sleep will be able to shake off whatever this is going on with me. Though it never felt like it, I must have gone to sleep. It was one of those sleeps where you always felt like you were trying too hard and where you could never get comfortable, but eventually when you look at the clock, you realize it's been an hour. I didn't feel any different. In fact, I think I may have felt worse. The knots in my stomach were still tying up every breath that I took. I closed my eyes, not to sleep this time, but just to focus. I guess now seemed like as good a time as any to try meditation. A few deep breaths in, a few deep breaths out, and absolutely no change. Hey, I looked to my left and saw a bug-eyed, overweight millennial who was hyperventilating at takeoff staring at me. You okay? Usually, in this situation, like every other time anybody asks you that question, I'd say, I'm fine. and leave it at that. For some reason, though, I found myself answering honestly. Maybe it was due to the non-stop mental barrage that I've been taking since I walked into the airport 11 hours prior, but I didn't respond with the usual. Instead, I told him the truth. No, I don't know what's wrong. I've had this sinking pit in my stomach ever since takeoff. I don't know what's the matter with me. This has never happened before. I'm the same way, he responded. I don't know what's going on with me. I feel like I'm in danger. Exactly. That's exactly what I was feeling. I didn't know why, but I felt threatened. Before I thought it was just anxiety, but it's developed into much more since then. I was trying to figure out why. What the rational explanation was for this almost primordial fear in my heart, when another voice jutted in. You boys too? An older woman, about 70 years old, spoke to us from the end of our row. The second we took off, and I don't know why, I got this huge wave of stress, like when there's a noise in your kitchen at 3 in the morning, she said. It's almost like something is going to happen, and I know that it's probably nothing, but still it feels like something will, something bad. Do you normally feel like this on flights? I asked the two of them. The millennial responded first. I've never been a huge fan of flying, especially with all the weird stuff that's been happening the past few years. All those disappearances. But I have to do it for my job. He looked down. I want a new job. Great. Just what I needed. One of those conspiracy-believing nut jobs to propagate whatever weird episode I was going through with his crazy person energy. The older lady spoke next. I never feel like this. I've been flying regularly for 50 years, and I've never felt like I do now. And it's not because of any of that conspiracy theory nonsense. You shouldn't believe any of that stuff. I smiled for a second as the woman, even when terrified, still took the time to lecture some stupid kid. It was a welcome break from the slow build-up of dread since takeoff. As I settled back in my seat, though, and thought more about their points of view, the feelings returned in full force. Sure, the younger kid feeling nervous was fully understandable. He believed all the fear-mongering on the news to his core, so obviously he'd feel uncomfortable on one of the longer flights one can take. The older woman, though. The more I thought about what she said, the worse my fear grew. She wasn't a nut job. Also, she was a veteran flyer. Even in the 80s, when hijackings happened every other week and all airplanes were practically held together with duct tape and chewing gum, she wasn't afraid of flying. So why now? The ding of the seatbelts on light as it flicked alive shook me like a gunshot. At the moment, I was somewhat happy about that, though. I mean, it forced me out of whatever emotional spiral I was falling down in my own head. I'm sure to everybody else I looked like a maniac in a trance. Somewhat embarrassing, I figured, since this was the second time in a single flight that I would have looked like that after I shrieked at the attendant's hand. My eyes shyly began to scan the other rows, sheepishly hidden under my eyebrows, but I didn't see any confused looks towards me. No, I would have preferred that. Instead, I didn't see a single pair of eyes in my direction. In fact, everybody was looking at the same spot. Down. I looked around all the rows I could see from my seat, and everybody was hanging their head, almost in defeat, as they stared fearfully directly down into their sweaty, clasping palms. Everybody felt like I did. Without even thinking about the movement, I quickly shot up and looked around at even more passengers, and sure enough, they were all acting the same way. I didn't know what was going on. This whole flight had been too strange for my taste. Why did, for the first time in half a decade, this flight have to be filled to the brim? Why am I so afraid of something I can't find a rational reason for? And why is everybody else the same way? Sitting back in my seat, I buckled my seatbelt and found myself tightening it to such an extent that it could have drawn blood. As if whatever subconscious fears these were ended up being well-founded, this thin band of polyester would save me. I just want to be in London. No, I just want to feel the ground again. Hell, I might even end up being one of those dramatics who applauds when the plane lands. How close were we? We've been in the air for 3 hours at this point. We must be close. I flicked the chair-mounted screen ahead of me back on and stared as it booted up. anxiously awaiting for the flight tracker to brazenly make its reappearance. I wish I didn't. When did I ask the flight attendant why we turned? 2.5 hours ago? It had to be. That's what the clock said, after all. I still just can't believe I slept that long. And why haven't we turned back? We're halfway up through Canada. I still wanted to believe that the weird weather excuse that the flight attendant mustered up was the truth, but I couldn't. It just didn't make any sense. Was I on the wrong flight? No. That's ridiculous. I didn't like that I was to the point of confusion now when my body's go-to rationale was that every move I'd made in the last half day was the wrong one. But besides that, I genuinely couldn't think of a single reason why we were heading exactly perpendicular to our destination, and practically have been from right out of the gate. The flight attendant that I talked to before about this, though I knew I'd likely get the same answer, was at the front of the plane. I poked my head out of my little personal bubble, over the millennial's lap and into the aisle, hoping to get her attention. Donning the cartoonishly confused expression one does when a stranger has an answer to their question, and waving an open hand every time she looked even somewhat towards my direction, I silently and anxiously awaited the however many seconds it would take until I might get an answer to my question, though I knew I'd probably get the same response. Took a few attempts, a few somewhat embarrassing failed waves, but soon enough she saw me and started towards me, but only for a few steps. Interrupting her walk was the opening of a door behind her, the door to the cockpit, and out stepped the pilot. I thought that wasn't allowed. I mean, since 9/11, haven't the pilots been locked away in the cockpit for the entirety of the flight? I mean, I was pretty sure, but still, that didn't change the fact that I was staring at the pilot standing at the end of my aisle. He took the attention of the flight attendant, and she gave me a hasty wave as if to say, "I'll get to you in a second, esteemed passenger." She spoke with the pilot, or rather, he spoke with her, for about 45 seconds, and being only able to read their expressions, it didn't seem to be of something good. Though he seemed a strong man, well-built, sharp jaw, light stubble, straight stature, he struggled to maintain eye contact. Instead, most of the time he stared sheepishly and almost regretfully down at his feet. What was he saying? Whatever it was, the flight attendant was not happy to hear it. Intermittently, she raised her shoulders in a physical accompaniment to her trying to challenge whatever he was telling her, but it was always bested by the beleaguered pilot's single open hand silencing her as he continued to fight through whatever terrible things he had to say. Without giving her the chance to speak whatever she was itching to for the entire interaction, the pilot returned to the cockpit, quickly closing the door behind him. I watched her as she seemed to struggle to comprehend whatever she was just told, and also waited to begin my second performance of trying to get her attention, just in case she forgot. With a quick bolt, she began to dart down the aisle towards me. Her company-mandated smile was nowhere to be found. Instead, it was replaced with tight lips covering her biting jaw. I waved to get her attention, as though I know she just got some bad news. I still wanted an answer where the hell we were flying to, if apparently not London. As I've had more time to process possibilities in the back of my mind, I realized that it must be a change to the itinerary. We're probably landing somewhere else and having a layover before we get another flight to London. It made little sense. Yes, but after all the chaos that this flight had been stuffed with thus far, I would not be surprised. She was about halfway to me at this point, and she still hadn't looked at my signal. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, but it was clear that they were looking at nothing in particular. Whatever she was so concerned with at the moment was inside of her own head. Purposefully or not, it looked as though she was going to ignore me completely. Though I'm sure that's common for the timid millennial to my left, it wasn't for me. I opened my mouth to verbally get her attention, but I was interrupted. In fact, it was she that interrupted me. About 3/4 of the way to my seat, a sharp whimper escaped her pressed lips as if it couldn't be held in anymore, and it was followed by the sudden watering of her eyes. She brushed right past me as I sat silent, surprised by her sudden emotion, and by that time tears had started to freely flow down her rosy cheeks. Flight attendants, I thought, were trained to be nothing but pleasant and helpful, and she was up to a minute ago. What did that pilot tell her? I figured it must have been a personal matter. I mean, perhaps she and he had a relationship of some sort, and for some reason he elected now as the best time to break it off. Or maybe she got some bad news from the ground that concerned her or her family. But no, I didn't buy that. I saw her eyes, and they were the same eyes that I saw worn by every passenger on this plane. They were fearful. Immediately my mind began to race again. I wonder if she too had the initial dreadful emotions at takeoff, but was just able to hide it better, since she'd done just that for so long as a way to make a living. And maybe now that she wore them, the shared fear from everybody seated in the cabin was much more rational than I thought. My puzzled gaze followed her to the rear of the plane, where I saw her speaking with the other attendants. Now the parts had switched. She presumed the role of the pilot, telling all the others the same bad news that she had just heard. Their faces were all the same. Looks of shock, of disbelief, of fear, of defeat. One of the three listening attendants began to cry. A powerful wail suddenly tore out of her throat before she silenced it almost immediately, but it was just the impetus needed to cause the others to join her. Urged by one another's misery, the circuitous display of sniffling soon turned into shortening breaths, which eventually turned into full, yet stifled, waterworks. As I stared, almost hypnotized by the confusing nature of it all, one of them caught my unwanted eye through her blurry vision and quickly snagged the dangling curtain between us and pulled it taut, separating the main cabin from their little pod in the back. I turned back straight in my seat. Now, though I didn't know what would happen, it felt so certain that something would that, for a second, my dread seemed to subside. It's like my mind had already come to terms with its inevitability. Quite honestly, it felt like whatever was going to happen had already happened. It's funny, I guess, how that works. It's almost like time traveling. I turned back straight in my seat. Now, though I didn't know what would happen, it felt so certain that something would that my dread seemed to subside. I turned back straight in my seat. Now, though I didn't know what would happen, it felt so certain that something would that my dread seemed to subside. It's like my mind had already come to terms with its inevitability. Quite honestly, it felt like whatever was going to happen had already happened. It's funny, I guess, how that works. It's almost like time traveling. For a few minutes, I sat silently in my seat, fully succumbing to my new feelings of defeat. I looked around the cabin now and then and saw the same worried expressions as before from each of the passengers. I suppose, in some type of twisted way, I was the lucky one now. The other passengers hadn't seen the whole ordeal on the back, so they were still stuck in anxious limbo, whereas I had crossed the threshold into utter hopelessness. Despite this, it was still a bit unsettling to see the flight attendants now walk, or I'd even use the word mope, around with grim, stone faces and dim, floor-pointed eyes. Their makeup had morphed with the teardrops running through it and dried into a new, permanent pattern of self-pity, but the crying itself had stopped. Over the next 10 minutes, I saw 3 different people meekly and confusedly attempt to hail one of them, only to be completely ignored. However, while I was shunned due to emotional urgency to tell the others something important, those others were out of sheer indifference. The attendants just didn't care. Like they all just gave up. Eventually, the passengers, all like it was hive knowledge, just stopped asking. The cabin was a vacuum of sound for the next 45 minutes. I gazed through the window for most of it, watching as the sea below slowly, almost painstakingly, became less and less liquid in its nature and was dotted with more and more splashes of solid bright white. The flight tracker confirmed that we were still heading straight north, but I didn't even have to bother to look at it. I don't know why I didn't feel the urge to try and courageously take control of the plane in order to save myself and all of the passengers, as I thought I always would have in a moment like this. It's a situation that every man thinks about from time to time. One of those weird thoughts that nobody talks about but everybody has. When you're actually living in the scene that you've painted in your dreams, you never have the gall that you thought you would have. Or, I guess, deeply rooted in whatever the subconscious thought was that was also causing the dread to begin with, I knew that it was pointless. Suddenly, a shriek from the front of the plane. Then, the cockpit door flew open as a flight attendant wantonly burst through it. The only thing that shot up quicker than me were the hairs on the back of my neck. It was clear that she just had another traumatic experience, except this one seemed much more visceral. Instead of trying to fight her emotions as she did when she last spoke with the captain, she donned them brazenly through her erratic dash down the aisle while ignoring the occasional ask about her well-being. Something happened in there. I instantly knew. And it was much more than just a bad conversation. I didn't know what was happening, but with the crushing fear returning, I suppose, so did my desire to understand what was going on. Everybody else on this plane can just sit here and take whatever horrible fate awaits us sitting down, but I won't. As I stood tall in the aisle, I took a final quick peek at the stewardesses in the back to see if they'd have any qualms with my standing. If I'd have to prepare to cause quite the disruptive scene as I pressed onto the cockpit while they tried to stop me. I had the head start, I suppose, but still, anybody rushing for the control room of a plane while getting shouted at by those trying to stop him would almost certainly face some type of obstacle from at least one of the passengers that blocked them from the captain's room. As I looked at them in the rear of the plane, I made direct eye contact with one of them, the one that just sprinted down the aisle. Within half a second, I had to consider all possibilities. Should I just sit down? Should I make a mad dash for the cockpit and just try to fight through any obstacles in my way? The latter would almost certainly land me in prison. Not a great look. But then, was it worth it? I knew something was going on within the minds of everybody on this plane, but was that just it? Within the minds? Fortunately or unfortunately, I had my decision made for me. As I held a gaze with the stewardess for the 2 or 3 seconds that I thought about all the possibilities, her arm reached out towards that little curtain that separates us from them, and she pulled it taut. Her eyes of panic were slightly, almost imperceptibly, infiltrated by total and utter carelessness. It's interesting how intense emotions can get. Just when I thought my fear was at its limit, that look made it all the worse. I thought about it for only a second before making my first step towards the cockpit. Not one person stopped me as I baldly flew toward the pilot's room. Some looked at me, and of those, some did so in confusion, but nobody did as much as say a word. I reached the door with more ease than it took to get to my seat at boarding. As I walked into the pilot's territory, I stared back towards the rows and rows of passengers who, now, even those who were watching me make my move, were all staring down. There was, however, at the back of the plane, one man who was looking at me in confused anger. I didn't hold his gaze for long, as if, by not looking at him, he wouldn't investigate any further why a random guy was going for an unannounced one-on-one with the 2 people in charge of the lives of everybody on this plane. The eye-dodging tactic works well during class or meetings when the boss asks you a question that you don't want to answer. I don't think it works as well during possible terrorist situations. Still, it was my natural reaction as I shut the door quickly. The last thing I saw before it closed, however, was the man, still staring, but standing up, too. I had limited time. When I finally turned to the 2 pilots, I found myself with the same terror that the stewardess had left with only a minute earlier. They were dead. The pilot was slumped over the left side of his chair while the co-pilot was on the ground. Since he was closer, I moved first to the latter. He was face down, or at least he should have been. That's the way his body was lying, chest to the floor, but his eyes were staring nearly straight up. The front bit of his face must have caught the side of the main pilot's seat and snapped his head backward, telling by the blood splatter on the armrest as he fell from whatever position he was in. Would have been a heinous way to go, but it didn't appear to be what got him in the end.
I figured that the real cause of his death had something to do with the foam coming from his mouth. Against my better judgment, it looked like poison or something. I was only able to digest and try to comprehend it for half a second before the back of my head was cracked by the broadside of the cockpit door. Before I even had time to stumble from the blow, cold metal wrapped around my wrists, one and then the other, and forced them behind my back, accompanied by clicking teeth as the steel became inseparable from my skin. A strong arm then grabbed my neck and forced me onto the ground. I wasn't surprised when the man who had stared at me from the back of the plane revealed himself. And I suppose I was less surprised by his militant reaction once he showed me his badge. What else would an air marshal have done? He hardly gave me the time of day, though, obviously electing to rather point his attention toward the two corpses in the room with us. His fingers reached for each of their necks, searching for a pulse, because I guessed the foaming in the blood and the man's head facing backwards weren't enough clues, before he exclaimed, "They're dead." Air Marshal? This guy should have been a detective. From the corner where he had pushed me down, I was able to get a good look at the pilot. He, too, had foam at the mouth, but unlike his co-pilot, tight handprints around his neck. They must have been self-inflicted, and it all but confirmed my theory of poison. Once he took the pill, he must not have truly understood the actual feeling of every organ failing at once as his entire nervous system was flooded with the sharpest pain one could ever experience. I suppose, though, what he was most concerned with at the moment was the inability to breathe. Obviously, the natural human reaction of gripping the neck wouldn't change a thing, but I guess, while the poison acted, he didn't dissect the irrationality of his final move. Upon deeper reflection of the situation, I was confused as to why I didn't feel any surprise when it was clear that the pilots killed themselves. I mean, of course, they could have been poisoned, but that didn't make any sense. From the somber conversation that the captain had with the air stewardess, he clearly knew that something absolutely horrible was going to happen. Likewise, the only person who was in the cockpit was that very stewardess. So, unless she did it? That made little sense, though. The biggest piece of evidence for me was that these men had cleaned up a bit prior to their death, seemingly in an attempt to die feeling more dignified. The main pilot had his entire uniform fully on and perfectly preened. Hat straight, coat buttoned, shirt tucked. It was unlikely that he was in such pristine condition for the nearly 4 hours of flying that we had done up to this point. In front of him, on top of the controls, was a photo of him with his family, and from what I could see, it was stained with a few wet droplet patterns, probably tears from when he stared at the photo and reminisced one last time. The co-pilot had worked on his appearance just as much as his boss did, or at least it looked like he did, despite some rufflings from the fall. I suppose a quick onset of pain made him fully seize and jump up before he collapsed. As I visually inspected his uniform, I saw in his hand closer to mine a phone. It was unlocked to a text conversation with the bottom messages perpetually stuck in the cycle of sending, failing, and resending. The first cryptically read, "I'm sorry. I don't know if you'll ever get this, but I love you. I'll always love you. I'm sorry." And then another, "I don't know why they had to choose us." The air marshal had been processing his mass onset of panic for about a minute, as I was also trying to understand the situation around me. In an instant, however, any semblance of professionalism that he had fully disappeared. He knelt down to meet me face to face, his left hand wrapped around my throat, taut but not enough to fully restrict airflow. His right finger came within an inch of my eye as he began to yell, "What did you do?" I'm sure his scream scared the already highly neurotic passengers, but in the grand scheme of problems at that moment, it didn't really matter. I don't know. They were like that. I saw all these weird things. I don't know what happened. My voice faltered as my mind was trying to string something of an explanation for what was happening out of my trembling jaw. He held me in that grip for some time. His stare burrowed deep into my eyes. Eventually, he threw me back against the wall with a quick snap of anger, and I stayed there on the floor, staring deeply into nothing. "I'll deal with you on the ground," he barked as he made his way over to the control panel. His fingers sporadically moved as they followed his darting eyes, taking a quick itinerary of each of the many dials and gauges on the dashboard. For about a quarter of a minute he did this, until he took a step back, put his hands on his waist, and he looked back over to me. "I guess we're lucky," he said. "Whatever your plan was, it failed." "Are we safe?" I quickly responded. "I'm sure you're upset about it." "I don't know what happened," I explained. "I came in here and they were like that. It's just, there's something weird going on with this plane." He looked at me with a grimace. "Save the bullshit." With that, he grabbed the headset that was neatly placed onto the dash by the now dead pilot and put it on. "This is U.S. Federal Air Marshal Jack Duncan. There was an attempted hijacking of flight LCT 1890 that I've stopped, but both pilots have been killed. Likely due, it seems, to a poisoning agent. I have subdued the assumed perpetrator and am awaiting further instructions on how to proceed." For a few seconds, there was silence. Through it all, he held the aura of intensity that is seen in any on-duty officer, but also through the subtle cracks of his demeanor, his regularly darting eyes, his trembling lip, his shaking left hand, which was quickly snagged by his right. It was clear that he was just as stressed out as anybody else on this plane. At least now he had a reason. Soon a crackle of static. The marshal's hands shot to hold the headset as close to his ear as possible while he trepidatiously awaited every word. "Who is this?" the headset asked. The marshal was standing close enough that I could just barely hear the other side of the dialogue. "This is U.S. Federal Air Marshal Jack Duncan. Is this ground control?" Another long stretch of silence before a simple "No." The marshal looked confusedly at the floor. "Then who am I speaking to?" he asked. "This is General Mutt Thompson," he responded, giving no more explanation. The marshal's shocked face intensified from this, but soon snapped back into his militant, determined expression as he remembered the severity of the situation at hand. "Well, General, I don't know why I'm speaking with you, but there has been an attempted hijacking of this plane, flight LCT 1890. I apprehended the perpetrator, but both pilots are dead. I need help in landing this plane safely. There are over 300 people on board." Through the headset, I was sure that I was hearing murmuring, but it may have just been static. Then, a new voice spoke. "Son, where is the plane currently?" it asked. The marshal was again thrown off by the response to his plea, but after a beat, he checked the flight map. When he saw the plane heading straight north, as it had been for hours at this point, he shot towards me and grabbed my throat again. "What did you do?" he yelled. Before I had the chance to respond, the headset jumped in. "Son, where is the plane?" it asked. This time it sounded like the general again. "Sir, for some reason, we are flying straight north, having taken a gradual turn within the first 30 minutes of our flight." This time, with the marshal's face being right next to mine, I was able to clearly hear the headset, and it was certainly murmuring on the other side. We were on speaker, and we had a huge audience. "Latitude and longitude," demanded a new, third voice. "It should be on the control board," a fourth added. The marshal sprang over and inspected the bells and whistles of the entire panel again before finally producing an answer. "About 74 degrees latitude and 64 degrees longitude." And he wandered back towards me. "They're nearly in the general area. Do we still have control?" the general asked. "Yes," the second voice answered. "That unlucky bastard just had to storm the cockpit," added a third. "Or maybe he's the luckiest man left on that flight," the general said to the others, before speaking directly to the marshal, who was listening to every word on the other end of the headset with utter disbelief. "Son, you need to listen to me carefully." At this, the marshal stood straight up, as if somewhat activated by the direct order from the general, despite its more colloquial nature. "Yes, sir," he responded. He took a step towards the control panel, likely assuming that he was about to get instructions on how to save the day, and I was then unable to understand anything said through the headset. All I could see was his face reacting to whatever he was hearing, and it certainly wasn't good. His expression became overwhelmed by dread as his arms dropped to his sides. "But why not, sir?" he asked. "There are innocent people here. We have the fuel. I can do this. I can land it." A few more seconds before he responded again. I thought those were just rumors. What's gonna happen to us? While listening to whatever they were telling him, the marshal's mouth swung open as if its hinges snapped. His left hand covered it as he tried to comprehend what he was hearing, while his right braced himself against the control panel, catching his weakening stance. Soon, the indistinguishable garble of the headset stopped, leaving only a dull, lingering static of a silent, yet open, line. As he further comprehended whatever he'd just been told, the marshal's body went limp, and he tumbled into the chair of the co-pilot who now lay dead on the floor. He didn't respond until 15 seconds later when succinctly, yet genuinely, he asked a single question. Why? From his new position I could again hear the actual words that were coming through the headset, and in an instant the general responded. Son, it's the only thing that seems to work. Then why do you still have to do it? We have the strongest military in the world. Why can't you just... The marshal protested, though his voice was still underlined with a paralyzing aura of hopelessness. We've tried everything, a new voice interrupted. A familiar one. Weirdly enough, it sounded like one I had heard before. Maybe on the news? The voice continued its thought. And this at least slows it down. This will save lives, Jack. It'll give us more time to figure out how to stop it. Son, it seems like you have two options here, the general softly said. For the first time, his tough, military man exterior was corrupted by the weakness of emotion. Pity, more accurately. The marshal stared out the window into the now snowy terrain as the voice on the headset continued. And knowing what you know now, it seems like there's really only one. Yeah, the marshal responded, tears now forming. He took the headset off and placed it gently on the control panel. Then he looked at me as he mustered up his strength and stood tall once more. I guess I should thank you. And in what seemed like an instant, the marshal grabbed his gun, brought it to his temple, and pulled the trigger. A splatter of red mist tore out of the other side of his head. The shell of what once housed everything that he ever was tumbled lifelessly across the floor of the small cockpit, landing perpendicular across the body of the co-pilot. When the ringing stopped, my ears were flooded with the screams from the cabin. I recognized what it was and what it meant, but I wasn't able to act. I just stared at what was the air marshal as he stared back, or rather, as his lifeless eyes just happened to rest, pointing towards mine. What was able to pull me out was the cockpit door flying open and slamming against the air marshal's head, which, without a fight, jutted out of the way before it was pinned hard against the wall. Through the doorway, I saw one of the air stewardesses, the young one that had stormed by me before, and I watched her shriek quickly travel from her eyes to her brain, and finally to her mouth. Behind her, I was able to see a small glimpse of the commotion occurring in the cabin, but it was enough. Most people were on their feet, scrambling around the plane looking for a possible way to save themselves from whatever was happening. They were guided purely by the evolutionary urge to survive, an urge that hadn't yet understood the futility of itself when 10 miles high. No matter, I thought. They'll realize eventually. Others, probably families, were hugging each other and weeping in what they likely presumed to be their final moments. Just one man was praying. The door swung shut again, severing my view of the cabin, though I could still hear the screams. At this, I found the strength to wriggle back onto my feet, though I was still handcuffed. I quickly inspected the uniform of the marshal and found the keys to my freedom dangling haphazardly out of his left pocket. Kneeling down with my back to the bodies, I tried to use my severely hindered arms and mental map of his body to actually get the keys. After a few seconds of wriggling around, I brushed them with my pinky finger and was quickly able to fully grab them. Just as I began the next task of trying to find the keyhole by touch alone, the front windows of the airplane were hit by a burst of energy and they cracked into a million tiny, though still barely intact pieces. Accompanying the shatter was the most hideous sound I've heard in my life. was like the shriek of a child meeting with the guttural growl of a hunting bear, and it was louder than anything I'd ever heard. Every muscle in my body seized up. The keys flew straight across the room behind me. I had no idea where they could have possibly gone. Within seconds, the blood that pooled out of my ears was dribbling down my neck. I couldn't focus on anything except trying to cover them, but my arms were fastened tightly behind my back. I wasn't letting that stop me. The urge of my body to cover my ears, though I'm sure it would have done absolutely nothing, was overbearing. My arms writhed about and twisted grotesquely while they tried to break free. Soon enough, I felt a distinct crack in my left arm, and the pain, though nowhere near what was happening to my head, told me that I'd just snapped a bone. It didn't stop me, though. My hands still desperately tried to free themselves. I don't know for how long, though I'm sure for no more than 10 seconds, the sound continued before eventually subsiding. Or at least, I think it did. Perhaps by now, I was just deaf. That would be a blessing. My vision was blurred, my ears were flowing blood like a faucet, the pain in my left arm was now able to properly make itself known, and in the disproportionate reflection of the co-pilot's sunglasses, I saw the bone protruding out of my skin. I took the few steps needed to gaze out of the plane's front windows, which now looked like a spider's web, attempting to see what caused whatever was going on, and truthfully, what was probably the last thing I'd ever see. A giant mass was emerging from the water on the right side of the plane, just barely visible from my vantage point. I had no idea how large it truly was, but just looking in its direction left a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was something incomprehensibly massive. I just didn't know what. It also confirmed that I was deaf, I realized, as all I could use to understand what was happening were my eyes. By now, too, the blood from my ears had trickled down my arms and was dribbling off the tips of my fingers, leaving a slowly yet methodically growing pool below me. Suddenly, my footing slipped out from under me and I collapsed as the airplane started to shake back and forth. The first thing to hit the ground was my protruding bone, and the only reason that I didn't scream as I would have was that, as I began to, my head smacked hard against the floor. Dazed and confused, and with different pains shooting up from every region of my body, I somehow found the strength to stand up again. I wasn't sure how much adrenaline my body was pumping through itself at this point, but it was keeping me up. Despite walking with the prowess of a zombie, somehow I was still moving. I went to reach for the door of the cockpit to get a gauge of the situation in the cabin when a man, a thin, older man, slammed against the other side and took it down with him right in front of me. He lay there, whimpering, trying to find the strength to overpower the injuries he just sustained and get back on his feet, but it was clear that he couldn't. All he could do was keep trying, and that's all he would do. Standing before him was the millennial, my old seatmate, and he stared at me. Whereas before I saw the frailty and underlying anxiety in his eyes, now it was just anger. Violent, intense, primal anger. But he didn't want me at that moment. Instead, with one hand, he grabbed the old man by the left ankle and pulled him. The old man fought, trying to grab onto something in the cockpit and resist, but it was no use. As the old man came closer to the reach of the millennial, the aggressor began pounding down with his free fist. All I could do with my arm still fastened behind my back was stare at the bloodshed. The millennial, still dragging the man, eventually turned out of the doorway, and I was able to see the rest of the passengers. It was the same. For an unexplainable reason, or maybe due to an imperceptible force, a portion of the cabin had become rage-fueled brutes and were beating down on the closest people they could grab. Some victims were those who seemed to retain their human side. Some were more of the violent ones. I saw men fight women, women fight children, old fight young. Just in my quick, panicked scan around, I could see that already there were a few dead bodies. And as I saw the millennial emerge from the nook where he had taken the old man just a few seconds prior, I knew that there was one more. It was insanity incarnate. Madness of biblical proportions. All I could do was watch, and as I did, I felt the tears finally begin to race down my cheeks. I stared, waiting for one of those maniacs to notice me. and I saw, at the edge of what I could see from the doorway, the young flight attendant. She was thrashing about wildly, but not at or with anybody else. No, she had a tight grip on the interior door handle, and she was using every ounce of her power to loosen it. For the first time in what seemed like forever, I moved. "Stop!" I yelled, as I staggered fully out of the cockpit and into the aisles of the cabin. But she didn't falter for a second. To my right was the millennial, now looking for a new target, which he found in me. The more immediate of the two very immediate dangers took my attention as he stepped towards me with arms outstretched. I retreated to what distance I could before I tripped over the small lip of the doorframe between the cabin and the cockpit and landed hard on my arms. I shrieked as my projecting bone ricocheted off the ground, and I rolled like a wounded dog onto my side and whimpered. The millennial made up what distance I'd created in 2 steps, and I watched as his left fist, crusted in other people's blood, wound back. But, in what I suppose was a cruel act of luck, the distance was suddenly made up again. A strong pulling wind began to drag me with it. I was able to grab onto the very lip of the doorframe that had just nearly killed me with my clawing fingernails. The millennial, however, had nothing to save himself. I watched as his body was seized by the immense power of the wind. It looked virtually lifeless, as its movements were now at the will of the drawing force, and the only way I was able to tell that it wasn't was by the fear in his eyes and his snapping jaw. In a second he flew across the cabin and joined the mass of people who were also violently jettisoned out of the plane. One man's head smacked so harshly against the top of the doorframe on his way out that the back of his head touched the center of his spine. I suppose he was lucky. My fingernails were beginning to fail me, and with my arms still strapped behind my back and one of them wholly useless anyway, I knew it was only a matter of time. I closed my eyes and deeply took what I knew would be one of my last breaths. A second later, I flew across the cabin due to no power of my own. And a second after that, I felt the crisp air of the clear sky as I began my plummet into certain death. Truly coming face to face with the impasse of morality is different for everybody. For some, it's sudden. For most, it's silent and perhaps even somewhat welcomed. For others, for me, they're able to feel every second of it, and though it doesn't overly matter if they're able to or not, rapidly try to come to terms with their forthcoming death. I don't know why I didn't feel anything as I fell. I wasn't afraid, I wasn't panicking. I was waiting. There was nothing I could do to stop it, after all. In a situation that I was all too familiar with by this point in the trip, my mind had already come to terms with its inevitability. It felt like it had already happened. The world around me was slowing down, or perhaps I was just more perceptive in my final moment. Looking around, I saw every other jettisoned passenger that was falling with me, all at different points in the air. They rapidly thrashed about like feral beasts, and with no victim to exert their anger upon, they turned to themselves. Tearing at their own skin, they dug out chunks of flesh from their legs and chests and faces and, good Lord, their eyes. They were tearing out their eyes. I fixed on the horror for what must have only been a second or two until something was somehow able to take my attention. I'd forgotten the giant mass erupting from the sea that I'd seen from the cockpit before I was attacked, but now I remembered. It was directly in front of me. And finally, for the first time since we took off, I understood. It was inconceivably large. Despite it being at least a half-mile away, it still took up most of the horizon. Never before had I seen anything so massive. In fact, I didn't know something so large could even exist. It was a dull gray and almost gelatinous in nature, with folds of its own body overlapping itself. What was most comparable to a head was crowned with a ring of eyes which all moved independently of one another. They darted about, constantly taking in every aspect of their surroundings in an instant, though, at this moment, most of them were employed as spotters for the falling passengers. It didn't have any permanent limbs. Instead, it was able to produce thick, snapping, whipping tentacles from anywhere on its capsule-shaped body, seemingly at will. The great beast had complete control over its physicality. Hundreds of tentacles were darting across the open sea and quickly snagging and wrapping around the falling passengers like a boa constrictor, as hundreds more sprouted from the beast and some from one another in the same instant. A second later, the holding tentacles were joined by a battalion of identical versions of itself. Tentacles is the word most similar to what they were, but they weren't. Though they were fluid in their motion and not bound in movement by anything internal, they were not covered in suckers. They were covered in beaks. Tiny, independent, growling, chomping beaks. Those in their grasp were being eaten alive by hundreds of tiny, razor-sharp, biting, prodding, piercing mouths. The lagging tentacles that came to the side of the initial began feigning and fighting for their own chunk of flesh. They each grabbed onto different parts of the person and snapped and pulled until they were able to retreat back towards the central mass of the great beast with a meal of their own. Arms, legs, and heads were torn from the torso in single, swift snaps of the beast's appendages. Chests were split in half. Some people were squeezed so hard by the constricting tentacles that their bodies popped from the pressure. Looking from victim to victim, I identified a new type of soldier that came from the beast. These ones, instead of tearing and biting, instead chose to invade. Through any means necessary, they found their way into the body. Eyes, ears, and noses were all forcibly opened and filled with an ever-expanding appendage. Obviously, the corruption resulted in an unstiflable scream, which only provided a new pathway for the beast. I wasn't sure if the victims died by suffocation, or by the beaks consuming from the inside out, or from a different unfathomable horror, but they didn't last long no matter the reason. Suddenly the sky filled with a great piercing roar, which I was only able to perceive from how its power rippled through the air and, for its duration, bested the power of gravity by interrupting my plummet down and instead throwing me sideways. I looked to the source of it, to the central mass of the great beast, and saw a massive beak that had emerged from within the folds of its revolting body, seemingly the only hard part of its central mass. Within its gape, I saw concentric rows of oscillating fangs, tearing any of the remaining pieces of people that made their way to it into a red mist near instantly. My go-to response was to feel pity for any sentient creature that made its way into it, but I quickly corrected myself, knowing nothing could survive up to that point. The plane, by now, had reached the end of its flight as it slammed hard against the side of the beast. Though it was engulfed in an explosive plume which rained down a few surviving metal shards of its hull, the beast didn't do as much as wince. In fact, not even one of its 100 eyes seemed to dart towards the event. It was a wanton show of strength, the one that I don't believe the great beast even meant to put on. My eyes once again fell upon the central body of the beast, yet this time I found myself gazing with admiration. As I stared, I was concerned with nothing except its very existence. Its being was repugnant, yet it was beautiful. It insulted the very image of God, but it had every justification to do so. It was beyond any ability I possessed to understand the great beast. But I knew one thing. It was above me. Far above me. I was nothing in its wake. Nobody was. There wasn't one person around me that was worthy to be in the presence of it. I couldn't help but stare at its beauty now, but I grew enraged knowing that ants, like men, dared to be near it. It was my job to make sure that nobody was. Luckily around me, I saw more and more of those who did have the audacity to be near such a god being picked out of the air by the great beast for its sustenance. What an honor. But then, I realized there was one more man. With a single pull, fueled by my enraged state, I tore my left arm out of the handcuffs and, holding it in front of me, saw a piercing, cracked bone in place of a hand. Then, around my other side, came my right arm with a dangling pair of now bloody handcuffs still attached. Without a second of hesitation, I began to tear at my own skin. I wasn't worthy of being near such a great creature, and it was my job to make sure I was no longer. Despite the dripping blood impairing my one good eye, my sharpened bone stump had already taken out the other. I was able to get one final look at the great beast in order to admire its beauty, and I saw how blessed I was. I had no right to be near it, and I knew that. But still, if it were to grant me the honor of being held by it. 6 of its tentacles were shooting across the horizon towards me, and I knew once they grabbed me, I'd have the distinct privilege of being able to provide sustenance to it. I felt no fear, no anger of death or anything of the sort. But beyond the primal rage that overtook my body, I did feel one thing. Hope. My final wish was that the great beast would seize me in its grasp and allow me the greatest honor that I could ever imagine before I was pierced by the jagged rocks of the cold sea below.